My intention is to give a gospel lesson, and so we're going to get right into it. I appreciate Colin reading that text for us. That is exactly where we're going to be at today, is in Mark 8:22 through 26. If you don't have a Bible, there should be one in front of you. Get it out, turn to those chapters. We're not going to move out of them, or get your favorite Bible app out and turn over to Mark 8. We're going to begin in verse 1 in just a second. Do you remember this miracle in Mark chapter 8, 22 through 26? This is not the first time Jesus has healed a blind person. In fact, across all of the gospel accounts, Jesus will heal blind people time in and time out. But this one is more unique. Do you remember it? Because Jesus not only touched the guy and he was healed immediately, in this miracle, Jesus did it in 2 stages. It points out that he first laid his hands on him, and he saw men like trees walking. What does that mean? And then Jesus touched him again, and he began to see everything clearly. And so this makes us ask a simple question. Why does Jesus do this miracle this way? It's only recorded in Mark's gospel as such. Why would he do it in 2 stages? There's really 3 options. One, the simple one, and it's true, Jesus wanted to do it that way, right? I mean, he can do it that way, so he can, and he did do it that way. But secondly, if maybe you're coming from a skeptic background, you read this miracle and you think, well, did Jesus get it wrong? Did he mess it up at the first, and then the guy was like, I didn't see everything, and then Jesus comes in and he does it again? Well, no, we know that's not it. Jesus is perfect. He does all the miracles exactly how he wants to do them. And the third option, which I think is the most likely, or is there a lesson within this miracle? You see, Jesus, when he does miracles, there's a purpose for them. He's not just out there doing miracles for any old reason. There's something we learn in the miracles that Jesus does. And whenever we want to answer a question like this, why? Why, Jesus? Why did you do it this way? I think for starters, it's helpful to remember that we have 4 gospel accounts of Jesus. And if you grew up like me, there was a bit of what we'll call a synoptic reading and understanding. Like when I would go up through my Bible classes, people would just teach me what all of the collective gospels said. And that's helpful so you can get the story of Jesus down. But did you know each and every one of the gospels actually have a unique reason why they were written? The Gospel of Matthew is littered with Old Testament references written to a Jewish audience so that they can come to believe that Jesus is the Christ. He is the rightful king, the heir to the throne. The Gospel of Mark, my favorite gospel, by the way, is written to a predominantly Roman and Greek audience. You don't see a lot of references to the Old Testament. He is trying to show the greatness of Jesus so that they may believe that he is the Son of God. The Gospel of Luke, written by a physician, a Greek, it says in the very beginning, he went and he talked to eyewitnesses. He's bringing us to the same place he was when he was trying to figure out who Jesus was. And so he testified. He went to other people who testify of Jesus. The Gospel of John, written much later, and still in the lifetime of the Apostle John, obviously, but it's a little bit different than the first 3 Gospels because he says, I'm writing these things down in chapter 20 so that you may believe in Jesus, believe in the signs, and have life in his name. So he goes through 7 I ams and 7 miracles in a very structured way. And so then we come to the Gospel of Mark, and I think there's something here with the fact that it's only included in his gospel. And so what I think we need to do this morning is take a look at the surrounding context, take a look at context clues to understand why Mark includes that Jesus healed this blind man in 2 stages. We're going to come back to this miracle here in just a short time, but let's go back to chapter 8 and begin in verse 1. Will you read it with me? Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 10. In those days there was again a large crowd, and they had nothing to eat. He called the disciples and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they've already stayed with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they'll collapse on the way. And some of them have come a long distance. And his disciples answered him, where can anyone get enough bread here in this desolate place to feed these people? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked them. 7, they said. Well, he commanded the crowd to sit down on the ground. And taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks and broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. So they served them to the crowd. And they also had a few small fish. And after he had blessed them, he said, these were to be served as well. They ate and were satisfied. Then they collected the 7 large baskets of leftover pieces, and about 4,000 people were there. And he dismissed them, and he immediately got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. Now, if you're familiar with the text of the Gospel of Mark, it's great. If not, not a big deal. But one quick thing you can do is Turn your Bible back over to chapter 6, and you can use your subtitles, and what do you learn? Was this the first time Jesus had done a miracle like this? Or had Jesus done this once before? Well, of course he had. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus had fed the 5,000 in Mark 6, 30 through 44. This was a familiar story to us. And again, it's something I missed for the longest time. I grew up thinking, well, Jesus fed 5,000. Well, it's not until you read the Gospel account that you go, oh, he did it 2 times. He fed the 5,000 and he fed the 4,000. The only difference is 1,000 less people in Mark chapter 8, and there were 12 baskets of leftovers in chapter 6, but now there's 7 baskets of leftovers. Okay, great. Jesus is going to remind them of that here in just a little bit. But when we get to chapter 8, there's a reason why we want to pull our hair out for the disciples. Because knowing that he had only done this in chapter 6, you watch the disciples struggle as they go through this in chapter 8. And you want to say to them, guys, what in the world? You saw this 2 chapters ago. I know they didn't think in those terms, but we do. You already saw Jesus do something like this. Why are you so confused? Why are you so lost as this problem presents itself? Jesus already did this, but before we throw stones, can I suggest that we do the same thing? Can I suggest that Jesus will deliver us through something, and yet the next time, there we are saying, Jesus, I don't think there's anything you can do here. We'll talk more about that in a second. In both of these accounts, though, in Mark 6 and Mark 8, it's important to notice that Jesus is having them do the serving. That's an important lesson Jesus is trying to instill in his 12 disciples. While Jesus does the providing, his disciples are doing the serving of what Jesus has given. And at the end of the day, isn't that exactly what we are to do? Serve and give what Jesus has so freely given, his grace. Are we being the ones that spread it wide and far like the disciples did? But here's the question I'm really getting to. At the end of Mark 8, 1 through 10, did the disciples really understand who Jesus was? Did they look at Jesus and go, Jesus, I finally know who you are, I get it? No. These men look just as lost as they did from the day they started following him. They do not understand what he is capable of. And if he multiplied the bread for thousands, can he do it for more than that? Can he do it for less than that? Things that these brethren, these apostles, are not understanding. And so, here's what I want everyone to do. If you've got a family report and you're taking notes on the back, at the bottom of each of these texts that we're going through, I want us to ask the question, do the disciples see Jesus clearly? At the end of these different encounters we're reading, just write a simple yes or no. Do the disciples see Jesus clearly? At the end of Mark 8, 1 through 10, I would suggest, no, they do not see Jesus clearly. Well, coming to the next story, it kind of continues to help us to understand this miracle we're discussing. Look at Mark 8, verses 11 through 21. Mark 8, 11 through 21. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, demanding of a sign from heaven to test him. And sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, why does this generation demand a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation. Then he left them, got back into the boat, and went to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to take bread and had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he gave them strict orders. Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. They were discussing among themselves that they did not have any bread. Aware of this, he said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Don't you understand or comprehend? Do you have hardened hearts? Do you have eyes and not see? Do you have ears and not hear? And do you not remember, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of leftovers did you collect? 12, they told him. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets full of pieces did you collect? 7, they said. And he said to them, don't you understand yet? I want to back up. I want to talk about the discussion Jesus has with his disciples, but I think it's important to understand why this conversation came up. Do you see what Jesus is doing in verses 11 through 14? I really want you to imagine to be Jesus and be 2 or 3 years into your ministry and think about all the run-ins that he has had with the Pharisees up until this point. Just take the Gospel of Mark, for instance. Do you remember at the end of chapter 2, whenever Jesus is on the Sabbath day wanting to get a little snack, and him and his disciples are out there rolling up the grain in between their hands, and they're eating it, and the Pharisees come, that's the Sabbath day, you shouldn't be doing that. And Jesus has a whole discussion with them on that. In chapter 3, it's not a really great chapter break in my opinion, but it's still the Sabbath day, and Jesus goes into the synagogue, and there's this poor guy with a withered hand. Have you ever met someone like that? I went to high school with a guy like that. And Jesus, he walks up, and before he does anything, the text tells us that the Pharisees are sitting there just, is he going to heal this guy on the Sabbath day? And Jesus, it says he's angry in his heart. He's grieved. How can they be mad that I'm going to heal this guy on the Sabbath day? And Jesus does it anyways. A little bit later, Jesus is going to cast out demons, and they have no way to explain it. And so what do they say? Jesus, the only reason you're able to cast out demons is because you're the ruler of the demons. That's the only reason why, and Jesus will point out to them, that makes no sense. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Jesus has had run-in after run-in after run-in with the Pharisees and showed them sign after sign after sign. And so when we get to a Jesus in verse 12 who sighs deeply in his spirit and says, no more, I don't think it's because Jesus couldn't do it. I think it's because Jesus knew that one more sign wasn't going to do anything for them. These people were so hardened in their hearts, one more sign wasn't going to do a thing. So you're Jesus, you're frustrated, and you get to powwow with your disciples. What's the first thing that's going to come up? Hey guys, we got to talk about the Pharisees. We got to talk about the Herodians, because their teaching and their lifestyle is poison. And he uses an analogy, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod, in verse 15. Guys, watch out for them. These people are problems. But when Jesus goes to use this analogy, this parable really, what did the disciples think that he's talking about? Oh no, we forgot to bring the leftovers. Do you see the connection between the bread and the leaven? Their head can't wrap around what Jesus is saying, but simply, oh, he's talking about the bread, those 7 baskets of leftovers. Have you guys ever left the leftovers on the table at the restaurant? How awful, right? That's what they're upset about. But is that really what Jesus' point is? His frustration is clear. And he asked them in verse 17, why are you discussing the bread? Don't you understand or comprehend? Do you have hardened hearts like the people he's trying to warn them against? And he gives them a reminder of the 2 times he already multiplied bread. First for the 5,000 in chapter 6, and then for the 4,000 just a short time before this. And I'll ask again, don't you understand yet? They're discussing the fact that they have 1 loaf in the boat. I think it's simple, brethren. He wants them to understand that if I can multiply bread for 5,000 men, and if I can multiply bread for 4,000 men, do you think I can multiply bread for you 12 men? Absolutely he could. And of course it's more than just about bread. He wants them to understand who he is, what he is capable of. But they're not getting it. And so I ask again at the end of this section, do the disciples see Jesus clearly? No, they do not. And so then comes our next story. When Jesus is approached by a blind man in verse 22. Let's read it again. They came to Bethsaida. They brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and brought him out of the village, spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him. He asked him, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking." Again, Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes, and the man looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." right on the heels of Jesus' clear frustration with the disciples' inability to understand who he is, this miracle takes place. And Jesus is showing them what their disbelief looks like. It looks a lot like seeing men like trees walking. Jesus is using this blind man to help the disciples understand something. They have settled to see Jesus this way. If you wanted your sight restored, if you were blind, we're back where I'm at in Harrisburg. We have a lady who was blind ever since she could remember. She was blinded when she was 9 months old. And I've asked her this question before in going through this text. Audrey, if someone walked up to you and said that they're going to restore your sight, and they do it, and all you can see are men like trees walking around, would you be satisfied? And of course she says no, because she wants to see clearly. Do you understand that that is exactly what the apostles have settled for? They have a foggy, a faint understanding of who Jesus is. They're not looking close enough. They want to just see Jesus for what he is. Just some carpenter that's saying some good things. And we get to be his guys. But Jesus is a lot more than that. And so, in verse 25, Jesus places his hands on the man's eyes. And I want you to notice a really small detail that I think is important. That the man looked intently. Maybe your translation says he looked closer. He leaned in a little maybe. He took the second look. And his sight was restored. The disciples need to zoom in a little bit. They need to pay attention. They need to continue to let 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. But they're stopping short. And so what is Jesus going to do with these 2 or maybe 3-year students at this point? What is he going to do to finally help them understand it? Well, let's just keep reading. That's the only thing we can do. Look at Mark 8, verses 27 through 33. Jesus went out with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the road he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, others Elijah, but still others are saying you're one of the prophets. But you," he asked them, "who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he strictly warned them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that it was necessary for the Son of Man to suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, be killed and rise after 3 days. And he spoke openly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning around and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are not talking or thinking about God's concerns, but human concerns." So Jesus, we'll talk about 31 through 33 in a second, asks a question on the way to this village. Who do people say that I am? It's really cool. It's kind of a 2-staged question right after there was a 2-staged miracle. And this first question just kind of gets the ball rolling. Hey guys, Jesus is recognizing I'm popular at this point. Anywhere I go, people are flocking toward me. What's the scuttlebutt? What are people saying about who I am? And it's really cool to understand and think through the different answers up to this point. Some people are saying that he's John the Baptist. I mean, do you guys remember back also in chapter 6, John the Baptist was beheaded. And so some are just simply thinking, John the Baptist, maybe he came back from the dead, or maybe he's just kind of like that guy, but yeah, he's just John the Baptist. He's also preaching that you should repent because the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That's all he is. Some others are saying, I think it's quite possible that he's Elijah. You know, he never died. He went up into heaven in that chariot of fire. So maybe this is just Elijah that's come back down. That's all he is. Again, both of those are saying, he's just a prophet. And the others are just saying, he's a random prophet. We don't know. But the second part of the question is far more important for you and I. Who do you say that I am? Can you think about how personal that would be? If I was walking with Jesus when he asked that, I think I would stop. Well. If someone stopped you on the road and asked you, who is Jesus, how would you answer? Let alone it be Jesus who asked you that. And Peter says, you are the Messiah. Your Bible translation might say, you are the Christ. Christ, Messiah, both mean anointed one. Peter is making a confession here. He is saying what is true and what is right. But I want to ask you, does Peter understand what it means that Jesus is the Messiah? Because making that claim that he is the anointed one, the one who is to take the throne, the king. Let me ask you, do you talk to a king the way that the Apostle Peter did in the next few verses? Do you rebuke a king whenever they tell you something? And yet, that's exactly what Peter does. For your notes, by the way, Jesus will warn the disciples that he is going to die and be buried and raised 3 times in the Gospel of Mark. And it's easy to remember. Mark 8:31, Mark 9:31, and Mark 10:32. Jesus says it 3 times. And it confuses the disciples because he's been speaking in so many parables that they aren't sure what he means. And that's why it says, no, Jesus was stating this clearly. And yet Peter still thinks he has the right to go and rebuke the king. So I ask you once again, do the disciples see Jesus clearly? No, they do not. And so this leads us to our last and our final clue. We're going to come back to 34 through 38 in chapter 8 in just a second. But I want you to look over at Mark 9 and read with me in verses 2 through 8. Mark 9, 2 through 8. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a mountain by themselves to be alone. And he was transfigured in front of them. And his clothes became dazzling, extremely white, as no launder on earth could whiten them. And Elijah appeared to them with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let's set up 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah, because he did not know what to say since they were terrified. A cloud appeared, overshadowing them, and a voice came from the cloud. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. And suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. So, you're one of these 3 disciples. You go up on a mountain. You don't know what you're looking at. And then there, Elijah and Moses come walking out. I guess they wore name tags because they knew exactly who these men were. But if you're Peter, or James or John for that matter, but we'll think about Peter for just a second. I want you to think about what these 2 men meant to Peter. Think about a young Peter growing up in the Jewish synagogue and hearing about these two men. What did these 2 men represent in the old law? Moses represented the old law itself. It was handed to him, he brought it down, and he delivered it to God's people in the wilderness and before they went into the promised land. Moses, oftentimes, is just referred to as the law of Moses. What a great representation. He is the deliverer of the children of Israel from slavery, and here he is on a mountain with Jesus the Christ, the Messiah. Elijah, a good representative of the prophets. He's often used that way. Like we mentioned earlier, we know he had no physical death, but was taken up into heaven in a chariot of fire. But he represents those who come to preach and uphold the law that God had given through Moses. And so between these 2 men, you really have represented the entire Old Testament, Moses and Elijah. And so if you're Peter, I hope you don't bash him too hard that when he doesn't know what to say, he says, I'm going to build you a tent. Tabernacle is the right idea, but tent, shelter. We're going to build 3 here, one for Moses, one for Elijah, one for Jesus. Because here's these 2 guys representing this, and then here's Jesus representing this. All of them are equally important, right? No. And that is where the disciples got the picture really quickly. Because no sooner than Peter puts his foot in his mouth, there comes this voice out of heaven saying, this is my beloved Son, something we had heard at the baptism of Jesus. But a little extra note from God here. Listen to him. You pay attention to what he's saying. Moses and Elijah are great, but they're nothing in comparison to who Jesus Christ is. You better listen up, boys, is what God is saying to them. And so I ask again at the end of this, do you think the disciples started seeing Jesus clearly? I think you actually move into a yes or no category there. They will not fully understand and know until the day of Pentecost. I think that's where a lot of things fall into place for the apostles. But this really moves us into what our application is today, which is, how do you see Jesus? How do you see him? If you wanted to place yourself on that timeline that's on your outline, where would you be? Well, for starters, you can see Jesus faintly, like the disciples did the majority of the lesson today. I think there's different ways we do this. I think, number one, we doubt his power. We doubt the power of Jesus. I mean, in the feeding of the 4,000, as if they had never been in this situation before, when Jesus says that they need to feed the people, they will say, where can we go to buy that much bread? Where are we even going to find that much bread in a desolate place like this? They're doubting Jesus' power. And I think there's some different ways we do that. I think sometimes we say, well, I can handle this, but he can't. Sometimes when we're going through a trial, we look at Jesus and we say, I really don't think you can do anything here. Your power doesn't belong in this situation. We think that it's all on us. Oh, how am I going to find this much bread in this desolate place? But that is not what Jesus wants them to know about him. He wants them to know that he can do something, and that they can lean on him, and that he has the power to help. Do you believe that about Jesus when you're going through a trial? Do you lean on him? Maybe another way we see Jesus faintly is just no growth in faith. As we've already emphasized, they get to the feeding of the 4,000 and they think that it's different. And we say that to Jesus sometimes. We're going through something hard and we say, God, this is different this time. I know what you did a couple months ago. I know what you did when I lost that loved one, but this time it's so different. And sometimes we don't learn from the past times that Jesus has delivered us. And we get it in our head that he can't do nothing. But oftentimes, when we convince ourselves that it's different this time, to Jesus, it looks as similar as it did to the 5,000 and the 4,000. Because it's the same Lord who delivered you back then, and it's the same Lord who's going to deliver you now. Will you trust him, and will you grow in your faith? Y'all, that's what faith is. Faith is applying those past times that God has delivered you to your current situation, even if it's something you've not seen before. Read through Hebrews 11, and you will see that point made over and over again with all of those heroes of faith. That they trusted God despite seeing things they had never seen before because he had done it for them in the past. And so if this describes you this morning, you need a second touch of Jesus. You need to go back to him. You need to say, Lord, I've settled for seeing men like trees walking. Help me to see you clearly. You need to lean in. And I'll tell y'all, there's a young man that I want to share with you. His name is Donye. He's up in the area that I'm in the Northeast. I met Donye at a college, and we had several studies through the Gospel of Mark. And it was at this point that he brought up and asked about salvation, and we talked about baptism. And up until this point, he looked at us after we laid it out for him, and he said, I'm not ready. There's sin I still want to be involved in. There's things I still want to do. And I just don't see that this is for me. I do not see Jesus like that. And I'll be honest with you, I appreciated him being honest with us and saying, after it was all laid out on the table, I'm not ready for this. I see Jesus faintly. But moving to this next part, the question is, do we see Jesus clearly? And there's a few things we can say to Jesus to help us understand how to see him clearly. Number one, Jesus, I will listen. Because the same way God called out of heaven and said to Peter, James, and John, you listen to Jesus, he's calling out to us as well and telling us to listen. And I think there's two barriers that we got to think through whenever we think about being good listeners of Jesus. Number one is just the art of listening. There's listening, and then there's like real listening. Husbands, do you know what I mean by that? You know what I mean whenever your wife is talking? And, yeah, I got it. And then later that day, you're like, honey, what did you say you wanted me to work on? And she said, you said you heard me. You also see this in kids. Sally, this is hilarious, and you all know this about kids, that when you're trying to talk to them, you can tell when they're looking through your eyes and not listening. And you're like, hey, I need you to actually hear what I am trying to say. Are you listening to what Jesus is saying? Are you really hearing it and listening to it? It's got to start with reading. This is my opinion. I think any read through the Bible series that's worth its salt has to have something Jesus said at least every day. We got to be in the Gospels. We got to listen to them. We got to make sure we're paying attention. But the second barrier to being good listeners of Jesus is that there's a lot of voices out there, isn't there? A lot of people out there saying they know what Jesus said. They're true in the first century as well. This is what Jesus is telling you. But the blessing for us, brethren, is that we have what Jesus said. And we got to learn to tune our ears to what he said. Remember the parable of the Good Shepherd in John 10? What did he point out about his sheep? My sheep know my voice, and they'll follow. The only way you're going to know the voice of the shepherd is if you'll listen and if you'll read. And how do we listen? Because Jesus, he's not one of those guys who talks like this. Jesus is loud. He's clear. I appreciate that about him. And lastly, on this point, when Jesus asks you, who do you say that I am? How do you answer him? Because if you've been listening to him, these last 2 points will bear out what you need to do. Number 1, Jesus, I will die. If you would, read with me, last few verses we're going to read this morning. Mark chapter 8, let's read verses 34 through 37. Mark 8, 34 through 37. Calling the crowd along with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life because of me and the gospel will save it. For what does it benefit someone to gain the whole world and yet lose his life? What can anyone give in exchange for his life? Jesus is calling on us to die, to give up our lives. Do you understand that's what Jesus is asking you for? To lay down your life at his feet, a self-sacrifice. And this is the exact process that Romans chapter 6 and Colossians 3 talk about. A deliberate choice to put off the old man. And in the waters of baptism, put on the new man. Are you willing to do that? And every day, take up your cross and follow him. That's what Jesus is asking you for, if you see him clearly. And then lastly, people who see Jesus clearly understand that he's asking us to follow him in newness of life. When you're raised out of the waters of baptism, you raise out running after him. Because that's what he's asking us for. Because if we follow him, he is the way, the truth, and the life. He leads us to the Father. Who do you want to take you to the Father other than the one who is seated at his right hand? But we have to follow him. We can't take our own path. We know where that path leads. Many in here, many of us have taken that path. We know it doesn't get us to the Lord. The determination to follow Jesus has to start every day, every morning. Not only have I died with you, but I will follow you wherever you lead me. And I didn't want to finish Danye's story on the last slide because it does end hopeful. Because a year later, we kept studying with Danye. And we came back to these same chapters. And Danye said, I see Jesus clearly now. And I'm ready to do these very same things that we're talking about this morning. I'm ready to listen to him. I'm ready to die to my sin and to follow him. He finally saw Jesus clearly. So I ask you this morning, do you see Jesus clearly? Or is there a sin in your life that you need to put behind you so that you can see him more clearly? There's a lot of Christians in here, but I also know there's a lot of people in here who aren't Christians and who haven't put on Christ in baptism. You will see Jesus clearly when you submit to him. Are you ready to die to him? Are you ready to bring your life before him and say, all that I have is yours, Jesus. because you can do that this morning. If you will repent of your sins, confess His name, and believe in Him, and be baptized, those sins will be washed away. If we can help you in any way, won't you come forward now as we stand and as we sing?